Gerald Bamberger, and today we're going to work a simulated multi-state bar examination problem in the area of property. It's problem Property2. You can find it on my website, www.profbamberger.com. If you haven't already worked problem Property2, why not take a moment, pause this presentation, go over to www.profbamberger.com, spend about 1 minute and 45 seconds working problem Property2, and then return and resume this presentation. Okay, I'm going to assume you've already worked problem Property2 over at my website. The correct answer is choice A. If Paul does not recover, it will most likely be due to the nature of the relationship between Paul and Donald. This is a difficult property problem in particular because it depends on a rule from the first restatement of property, which has since been overturned more recently in the third restatement of property servitudes. The thing is, the first restatement rule is very much entrenched in the law. Many jurisdictions still follow the first restatement rule. I can't tell you exactly how many jurisdictions. It would be folly for me to do so because I expect this tape to be around for a while. But the third restatement rule hasn't completely eliminated the first restatement rule, so it's something you should be aware of. In fact, choice A is correct under the first restatement rule, which is still maintained in a number of jurisdictions. Choices B, C, and D wouldn't be correct anywhere. So the only possible correct answer is choice A. Choice A is correct because the first restatement rule required horizontal privity between the initial covenanting parties. Paul and Donald here were not in horizontal privity. Let's take a closer look at the notion of horizontal privity. Here we have an agreement between Paul and Donald. Paul and Donald have agreed that they will only use their land, each will only use his land for single-family residential purposes. Now, as between Paul and Donald, that agreement is binding. No problem there. The issue here is whether the agreement will bind land grab. Why? Because Paul is trying to sue land grab. Now, in order for Paul to sue land grab, there needs to be more than just an enforceable agreement with respect to Paul and Donald. There needs to be the idea that the agreement has sunk its tentacles into the soil. There needs to be the idea that Paul will be able to go after a successor in interest, that a successor in interest will be burdened. In order for that to happen, under the first restatement, there were a number of conditions. Now, first of all, notice that this is a transaction in interest in land. So the first thing we need to worry about is the statute of frauds. Now, that's no problem here. We have a written agreement. We're told that Paul and Donald have executed a written agreement. That's no problem. Second thing we need to worry about is the intent to bind successors. Now, again, the agreement is binding as between Paul and Donald. That's easy. The question is, will the agreement be binding so that land grab will be bound by it? At a minimum, an intent to bind successors is required. Here you have that intent explicitly. You don't need to imply it. So that's also easily found on these facts. Now, with regard to the first restatement, with regard to the old rule, let's call it, the agreement needed to touch and concern the land. Here, the agreement does touch and concern the land. The agreement is about the use of the land as a single-family, for single-family residential purposes. The touch and concern requirement is met. Where we get to a problem under the first restatement rule is with the privity rule. Now, there are two privity rules, horizontal privity and vertical privity. Horizontal privity concerns the relationship between Paul and Donald. Vertical privity concerns the relationship between Donald and land grab. Vertical privity here is satisfied. It's not a problem. Land grab is purchased from Donald. Land grab isn't an adverse possessor. Land grab isn't taking only a portion of the estate. Vertical privity is no problem. Horizontal privity, however, is a problem on these facts. Under the old restatement rule, under section 534, horizontal privity was only present if the promise was made in the context of either a grantor-grantee relationship in the sense of a transaction in land or an adjustment of an easement relationship between the parties. Here you have Paul and Donald, who are just neighbors. They wake up one morning and they decide to execute this agreement. There is no accompanied land transaction. There is no accompanying easement adjustment. Therefore, on these facts, there is no horizontal privity. That is fatal to what? That is fatal to the ability to bind successors at law. Can't bind successors at law under the first restatement rule. Okay? Can't bind successors at law under first restatement rule. Each of those things has to be considered. Now, land grab is a successor. Remember, Donald is still bound. Why? Because the agreement was between Paul and Donald. But the absence of horizontal privity between Paul and Donald means that land grab can't be bound at law. At law means money damages. Paul can't get money damages out of land grab. Paul could get injunctive relief out of land grab, but here Paul is asking for money. The absence of horizontal privity prevents him from getting, from recovering at law against a successor. Finally, it only prevents him from recovering at law against a successor under the first restatement rule. The old rule required horizontal privity. The new rule, which is found in section 2.4 of the restatement third of servitudes, says no privity relationship between the parties is necessary to create a servitude. That's why the correct answer is A. The only reason why Paul would lose here is if the court were applying the old rule, the restatement first rule, and Paul would lose because his action is at law and there is no horizontal privity between Paul and Donald. So the correct answer is A. If Paul does not recover, it will most likely be due to the nature of the relationship between Paul and Donald. If Paul doesn't recover, remember, Paul is suing for money damages. If Paul doesn't recover, it will be because Paul and Donald were not in horizontal privity at the time of the making of the promise. Therefore, under the first restatement rule, under the old rule, the promise can't be enforced at law against successors. The promise can't be enforced at law by Paul against land grab, who is a successor. Paul can't get money damages from land grab under the first restatement rule. Under the more modern third restatement rule, Paul could recover against land grab, but again, for those jurisdictions, assuming we're in a jurisdiction that still abides by the first restatement rule, Paul wouldn't recover. The other three answers are completely wrong. Let's look at choice B. Choice B says if Paul doesn't recover, it'll be due to a violation of the rule against perpetuities. Remember, the rule against perpetuities doesn't prevent anything from happening forever. The rule against perpetuities prevents an interest from vesting at a remote point in time. There is no remote vesting on these facts. There's no interest that will vest at some point more than 21 years after the deaths of all lives in being, or potentially vest more than 21 years after the deaths of all lives in being. Rule against perpetuities is a red herring on these facts. Choice C, Paul's failure to record the Paul-Donald agreement. Well, Paul didn't record the Paul-Donald agreement, but it doesn't matter because land grab knew about it. Land grab had actual knowledge of the agreement. Remember, land grab had earlier approached Paul. Paul declined the offer, citing the agreement. Then land grab approached Donald. So at the time land grab approached Donald, they knew about the agreement. The fact that the agreement was unrecorded is no defense for land grab. Finally, choice D, if Paul doesn't recover, it will be due to a finding that the Paul-Donald agreement was an unlawful restraint on alienation. This isn't a restraint on alienation. Doesn't prevent anyone from marketing their property, from selling their property, from transferring their property. It's a restraint on use. And restraints on use, servitudes, are not disfavored. So this is not a restraint on alienation. It's a valid enforceable servitude.